And on page 58, here's another way of putting the previous clip. So he says, what ails the frustrated? It is the consciousness of an irredeemably blemished self. Their chief desire is to escape that self, and it is this desire which manifests itself in a propensity for united action and self-sacrifice. So he talks about those two things. He says on the next page, both united action and self-sacrifice require self-diminution. In order to become part of the compact whole, the individual has to forgo much. He has to give up privacy, individual judgment, and often individual possessions. So I think that's pretty self-explanatory, but also I guess the main point here is that to join these movements, first of all, the mass movements, people, the leaders of them, etc., the recruiters, they identify that this person is corrupt or is needs help or something like that, some way of trying to create a problem in the individual. And then that individual is led to believe that they have to escape that polluted self. And the only way to do that, of course, is to join this mass movement and to also shed more of their individuality in order to fully commit to a new life in united action and self-sacrifice. So he says on page 60, to ripen a person for self-sacrifice, he must be stripped of his individual identity and distinctiveness. And so he says, I'll just kind of paraphrase. So he says, you're no longer Sally, Bob, etc. You are now a German, a Muslim, a Russian, a Christian, whatever it might be. The gay lobby, the social justice warriors, whatever it is. You're something else now. You're fighting the racists, or etc. Or you're a feminist. There's all kinds of other groups. Or you're part of the LGBT community, which it's always hilarious to me to hear that, because the LGBT community aren't a community. They don't live together. They don't talk to each other. People who are not straight or etc., people with gender fluidity and whatever, these people don't know each other. They're not part of a community. They don't have the same views. They're vastly different people. You can't speak of them as a community. Like there's no such thing as a white person community. I guess we believe that there's enough white people that you can't lump them together in a community. Same with, is there a black community? They don't talk to each other. They don't agree politically. But for some reason, we're led to believe that minority groups toe a line and all believe the same thing. It's just nonsense, and we shouldn't expect it either, because parts of those groups, people in those groups, will then believe psychologically that they have to then defend their race or defend their sexuality, and that's wrong. We shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't be making those assumptions. They should be allowed to come up with their own ideas, and it should be respected for doing it. And I think perhaps part of that prejudice is what makes these mass movements possible. For there to be an LGBT community, for example, would suggest that these people have been bullied for all the same thing, and therefore vote in a bloc. And that's wrong. They shouldn't be. And we should expect them to make up their own minds and not believe that they're just stuck in some community that they have to all vote the same way. So he says a bit more on page 61. The effacement of individual separateness must be thorough. In every act, however trivial, the individual must by some ritual associate himself with the congregation, the tribe, the party, etc. And then just below that he says, this is undoubtedly a primitive state of being, and its most perfect examples are found among primitive tribes. So there's no doubt about that. And if you can look at any protest put on by these mass movements, you'll find them quite primitive, often violent. If you look at social justice warriors in the universities, for example, they'll pull fire alarms. They'll block entrances, and they'll attack people. They're pretty violent. Even the Wall Street movement, there was bits of that. Environmentalists, some of them will put spikes in trees. There's all kinds of things that they'll do. They don't care. They're part of these mass movements, and it's very primitive, and they're doing this self-sacrifice stuff, and thus don't care about ethics, and believe that their united action is for a greater good, and that greater good, as I think it was Mao who said that we have to break some eggs, and we'll do that. So they'll engage in violent behavior. They don't care what the consequences are, as long as it's fulfilling their emptiness by supporting a mass movement with a greater agenda. And a perfect example of all this too is when you see them on debates, And when you see them getting attacked, and I'll just read a little bit of this on page 62. So Hoffer says that the unavoidable conclusion seems to be that when the individual faces torture or annihilation, he cannot rely on the resources of his own individuality. His only sources of strength is in not being himself, but part of something of mighty, glorious, and indestructible. So if you watch debates, you'll notice that at some point, especially feminists is a good example, at some point they will pull their group card and they will say, but I'm part of a mass movement. They will draw on what they see as the power of their group affiliations. Or they'll flip, if it's a racial discussion, they'll flip the race card and they'll say, or the culture card or whatever, the gender card, and they'll say, but I'm part of this group and I have authority because of that. You'll always see that when they're losing a fight and they can't depend on their own reason and their own facts or so-called facts that they come into the debate with, they will pull their card, they will pull their movement card to try to get the audience or the other people debating that person to believe that their authority is not just in their own ineptitude, but rather it is in their group affiliation, and that they can't be questioned because they are part of this group and that they're doing these. And then of course they'll go through the role of what that group's agendas are and how righteous that group's agendas are. So you'll see that pulling out, that individuals debating, and they start to lose, the individual will pull their group and speak from their group's perspective and then condemn everyone else for not being in their group, and they'll do all those kinds of tactics.